Okay. So a little bit about Frank. He was born in 1931 in Vancouver and passed away in 2022. He moved to Port Coquitlam in 1934. He had four brothers. He was married to Carolyn for 60 years, and they had a daughter, two sons, and two granddaughters, as well as many nieces and nephews. Frank retired from the Port Coquitlam Fire Department in 1991, and that's after that time. That's when Frank became a volunteer with the proposed Pinecone Burke Park, as well as joining the Burke Mountain Naturalists. So a bit of an odd photo to start with, but this is sort of my real first connection with Frank without even knowing it at the time. I moved to Port Coquitlam with my family in 1977, and we moved on to Lob Avenue in 1978, only about a block to a block and a half away from where Frank lived. And I went to school with a couple of Frank and Carolyn's sons, John and Dan, and without even knowing it at the time that it was a neighborhood, not big, not big friends with John and Dan, but there must have been a one day, because it's so set in my head. It was such an amazing time that somehow word got out in the neighborhood that there was a slip and slide at the Nick House, and it was a double length slip and slide, and Frank's backyard is huge and on a slope. And so I don't know how many kids from the neighborhood were there playing the afternoon, but it was a very, very fond memory of my own. And that would have been in probably about 1979 or 1980. So that's really my first connection with Frank. And as I mentioned, I did go to school with his sons. So just going through the different years, I first met Frank again. If I did meet that day, I'm not sure. But 93 was the time when we started working on trails in the proposed Pinecone Burke Park. And just to give you an idea of the age difference, Frank is was 35 years older than I am. And I just sort of keeping a track as we go along, milestones of Frank as he went through, and just how amazing of a guy he was to do the things that he did. So it all started in the Widgeon Valley. This is a bridge across the Widgeon Valley. It's in far worse shape now than what it is in this picture, but this was the gateway to get up to the upper Widgeon Valley. And this is where we started working with the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, the Burke Mountain Naturalists, and clearing the old road that would take us towards Squamish. So start with a lot of hand tools, doing trail work. This is Snow Cave Creek as it was back in 93. I've been up there a few times in the last couple of years, and you would not recognize it to look like this now. It's all grown in conifers very tightly, and the creek is quite deeper than what it is in this photo, and rarely has water in it. Again, this work we did clearing the old road. I was interested in those days when we did clear the road. There was lots of views of the mountains and the waterfalls in the area, but nowadays the trees have grown up an awful lot, so you don't see as much from the road. But the road is actually a lot clearer than it was back in 93. So this is, as I mentioned, lots of waterfalls. And we worked our way up to the head of the Widgeon Valley. When we first started, we were just doing day trips, but as we got further up the valley, which is about 14 kilometers long, we had to start doing overnight trips. One of the areas, once we sort of finished with the upper Widgeon Valley, we moved over to what we called at the time the Widgeon Bowl. And this is the trail that goes from the Widgeon campsite up and over to Burke Mountain. And we call it now the Burke Widgeon Connector. This is one of our favorite spots to stop for water. Our camp back in the 90s was sort of one switchback higher than this. And we had quite a nice camp at that time, right on the creek. It was in a mature alder forest, and this was one of my real vivid memories of Frank. We're standing there probably after a hard days of work doing trail work, and we're looking around at the area where we camped. Like I said, it's a mature alder forest. And Frank looked and said to me, he goes, look at these conifers, these cedars, these hemlocks, these Doug firs. They're all about, 3 feet high. He says, give these a few years and these will take over this forest. And that was something that just really set in my mind, that thinking, wow, these trees that are only 3 feet tall and these other alders that are probably, 20 or 30 feet tall, they'll outgrow them. And I was like, it was amazing for me. And sure enough, exactly what that area is like now. Now, I don't have a photo of that area because it got sort of our campsite area got destroyed by the creek blowing out. But yeah, it was something that I've really passed on to other people. Just how a forest regenerates. This is the old road that leads up. This is much higher up. Looks like it could still be driven, but lower down the road is a lot rougher. And this is approaching what we call Dawn's View. There was a lady that was on the trail crew. Her name was Dawn, and the viewpoint faced where the sun would come up, so it was a perfect double name for the area. This was back in about either 93 or 94. We were clearing out the viewpoint. And that's what Dawn's View looks like. Looks down onto the Pitt River and the Widgeon Slough. And if you look far enough in the background, you see Mount Baker poking out behind the UBC Research Forest. And just called Widgeon Bowl, area that was super thick in salmonberries. This was Lyle in 2010. We were up there trying to clear it out. It was a lot of work. We've had some crews in the last 2 or 3 years, and we've made some real headway in not only cutting the salmonberries back, but actually digging out the roots. And it seems to be holding quite well. Again, from the Widgeon Bowl area, look down on the Widgeon Slough area and across to Grant Narrows. And then be above the bowl, heading up towards Burke Mountain, we had to put in a lot of switchbacks. So this is John Gillespie doing a lot of mattock work. 1995. So big deal for Pinecone Burke Provincial Park. So this was on June 8th, 1995. This was the announcement of the Pinecone Burke Provincial Park. And it was quite interesting because this is when it took a real turn. Before this, we were doing a lot of trail work. And once it became a park, BC Parks basically kind of told us that we don't want you in here anymore doing trail work. So we turned our sights to hiking. And we were already hiking, but this was strictly just hiking. So if Glenn's there, I'll turn the mic over to him, and he can tell the story of the Telegraph Trail.
Well, thank you, Ian. Okay. Frank and I did a few backpacks together, more than a few. And in 1993, I read a book called Descendant of Madness, which was an account of Mike Orris, who is also called Crazy Mike. And he roamed around in an area. When you go up the coast far enough, you leave British Columbia and you start being in coastal Alaska. And on the other side of the mountains, it's British Columbia. So I'm talking about an area that's east of the Alaska Panhandle and south of the Yukon border. And Mike Orris wandered around in there and he managed to kill a few policemen. And it was quite a story, but it got me interested. And I went down to the Vancouver Library and I learned about the Yukon Telegraph Trail. And the Yukon Telegraph Trail existed from about 1900 into the 1930s, and it was a trail between New Westminster and Atlin, and also to Dawson. And it was an alternate way of getting to the gold fields. And it was maintained by pack horses, and men would go in there, they'd be provisioned in the fall, and there'd be a cabin every 32 miles. And when the telegraph went off, somehow each man in each of his cabins would know it was which section of the telegraph line was down. And his responsibility would be to go 16 miles in both directions from the cabin, and there'd be an overnight lean-to. Anyway, so I learned about this 100-year-old trail, and I contacted Ministry of Forest, and they said, well, there's one of the Tatlin Indians, Fletcher Day, who's in his time was a very, very famous trapper in the area, very colorful man. And he had taken a team of pack horses in there sometime prior to 1993. And I got a hold of his log of his pack horse trip into a portion of this area. And I got Frank interested in this. And so Frank and I drove up to Telegraph Creek, and we chartered that plane there, a little Cessna. And we got dropped in into a lake there, and it took us more than a week to hike back out again. And I really appreciate Carolyn letting Frank come with me, and I really appreciate Frank's confidence in me, because quite frankly, GPS had not been invented at this time. And so it was strictly map and compass. And it really wasn't a trail at all. So we frequently make mistakes and have to backtrack and so on. So that was buckbrush that you looked at before. So it rained most of the time. It got down to 0 centigrade one night. And so we were wet pretty much every day. And that's probably one of the old cabins in the background, and that's the tent that Frank and I slept in every night. So I don't think there's much more to say about that. Oh, the photograph that you saw that was on the promotion for tonight is actually a picture of Frank on that very same trip, and you can see that smile on his face. That's a permanent fixture. You can never take a bad picture of Frank, because he always had that wonderful smile on his face. And that's one of the minor streams that we crossed. The big stream was the Tatlin, and it was in flood because of all the rain. And the big problem was how to get across that river and have a dry pack. It gets a little bit wilder further on, and it was a major concern. What else could I say? Yeah, I guess that's about as much as I can say about that particular trip.
I was going to point out, especially after putting this presentation together, that I always knew that Frank liked to hike in jeans. For me, jeans.
I could say something about Ian. And matter of fact, I was going to. And the last thing you could accuse Frank of is being a gearhead. I would go down to MEC, and I'd always encounter somebody there who is looking at the latest gear, but you would never find Frank down there. So every hiker knows that you never wear blue jeans. Well, that's what he's wearing.
Yeah.
and that's not a Gore-Tex jacket. That's just a regular jacket. And it seemed like a lot of his hiking gear and his outdoor gear came from his family. I remember I had $350 Gore-Tex lined hiking boots. And I remember the day that Frank explained to me that one of his family members had been out to work Werewolf and bought him a pair of boots. So, and the other thing about Frank is that, particularly on this trip, we were pretty much wet all the time. And so I would start the day off, and then, with certain clothing on, and then after a while you'd get heated up and you'd change, and the sun would come out, the sun would go away, and you'd be changing back and forth. Frank would dress in the morning, and that would be the clothes he wore that day. And then we get into camp, and he'd do whatever he needed to at the end of the day. But he certainly didn't fuss with his gear. He had a smile on all the time. He was just a really wonderful companion. We never, ever had an issue about anything. And there's another point I was going to make too.
I'm going to have to move on, Glenn. I'm sorry.
Sure. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, what I might make point was that going through all the photos and everything, Frank, you'll see as you look at it, how many times he's wearing jeans. And I think there's only 2 photos in the show, or 2 trips on the presentation where he's not wearing jeans. And the next photo is one of those. Frank was across the creek, though. That's one of the photos, and that was the only reason. Otherwise, he would have been wearing his jeans. So Coquitlam Mountain was something that Frank looked at from his breakfast nook, from what I've been told, and it was always something that he wanted to do. Frank rarely phoned up and said, "Let's go somewhere." Usually, it was Glenn or I contacting Frank and saying, "Do you want to come on this trip?" But in this particular case, Frank was really keen on doing Coquitlam Mountain. And I know I did an attempt with Frank. I'm not sure if it was the same year or a year before our actually successful summit, but we did one trip where we actually hiked over Burke Mountain and camped in the Ore Creek drainage. And then the next day we tried to make a trip to the summit, and it just started to get fogged in about an hour before we got to the summit. So we had to turn around and go back. And then on this particular time in 1995 in September, we were successful. But I just wanted to point out up in the top left, the snow peaked, that's Coquitlam Mountain, and in the foreground is Burke Mountain. And we basically had to go through this little gap here and drop down into Ore Creek on the other side. That's another view of Coquitlam Mountain with Burke Mountain on the right. So once we crossed over Burke Mountain and made our way down to the Ore Creek drainage and up the road to the end of that, heading towards Widgeon Peak, where this is Widgeon Peak here, we eventually turned to the left and headed up into this little valley here, and then coming towards the front of the photo, I guess, and heading up towards the summit of Coquitlam. So this is what you'd see as you're approaching the summit. And this flag, I don't think the cloth was on the flag when we got there, but we put it on there. We believe the post that's up there was put up there by Doug Benny when he was up there with his dad in 1967. They put a centennial flag up there, and I believe it's probably the same post. And this is looking from the summit towards Coquitlam Lake and beyond. And looking to the east, we're looking into Hanging Valley, which is in the foreground here. And then just below that would be the Widgeon Valley. And then beyond the next ridge is Pitt Lake. And then the mountains in the background, the one on the far right or top right is Robbie Reed. And the double summit one is Judge Howe. You'll see those mountains in some other photos. And again, from the summit, looking down on a lake called Gabbro Lake and Gabbro Peak. And Gabbro Peak has been on my list for the last little while to climb. So I'm hoping at some point I will get up on top of Gabbro Peak. So this is the group photo of us on the summit. Now it's not the greatest photo, but it does have all 5 of us in the photo. You got Frank on the left, Jack Norrie, Don Gillespie, Glenn, who was just speaking, and myself in the foreground. The next photo is quite a bit better. You can actually see who we are, but Frank must have been taking the photo because he's not in the photo. And there's a classic photo of Frank on the summit of Coquitlam Mountain. It was a great day for all of us. And then 96, Frank would have been turning 65 that year, and I would have been only turning 30. I point this out just because 35 years difference as you get older is a huge thing. Amazing between Frank, Don Gillespie, which was only 6 months older than Frank, and Glenn as well was I believe 13 years younger than Frank. So Glenn, if you can just say a few about the Stein trip, but we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, we're talking about the summer of 1993. And the summer of 1993 is remarkable because that was the year of the big fire in the Stein. And so the Stein was closed. No one was supposed to go through there. But Frank and I wanted to do it, and we did it anyways. We did it in September. But I felt pretty safe going through an old forest fire that was burning in places with a fireman. And yeah, so this is the Stein Traverse goes from Lizzie Lake near Pemberton to Lytton, and it took us about a week. And this is one of the crossings. So because of the closure of the trail due to the forest fire, we didn't meet anybody else. We had the entire route to ourselves. And this is on the other end. So we've completed it, and we're about to catch the Greyhound bus and go home.
Actually, I got some of the photos out of order here, Glenn. So you might maybe just comment. This is Lizzie Lake.
Yep. So this is the start. So Frank's brother Al dropped us off on the Pemberton side. So we just dropped off Lizzie Lake. We're ready to head off to Lytton.
And you can't drive to Lizzie Lake anymore. Not the last time I was there anyways. And there was lots of blowdowns on the trail as well.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a trip that that Glenn did as well, but he didn't have a lot of notes on it, and only one photograph. So I threw in some photographs of my own. This is the Debec trip through to the head of Pitt Lake. So this is looking up Debec Creek. And as you get further up Debec Creek, it gets quite wider. And there's quite a few sort of meadows along the way. And then by the time you get to the other end of Debec Creek, which I believe is about 10 kilometers long, you look back at what you've come through. And if you look at the top right, you can see some of the 5 fingers. And that'll come up in some future trips. So once you cross over from Debec Valley, you look down into the Bull Valley. And the next photo will be the one that Glenn had from the trip. This was a gentleman by the name of Terry Tyler. That as Glenn put it, he was asked by somebody else to see if Tyler could come along, and Glenn did as much as he could to try and avoid taking this person on the trip because he didn't know, what sort of shape he was in or if he'd be able to do the trip. But from what Glenn said, he was able to do the trip, but did say it was probably the toughest thing he'd ever done. And so this looks like it's near the top of the Bull Valley.
Yeah, this guy has quite a repertoire of mountains he's climbed in Europe. He was over from Britain, and a mutual friend said, "Oh, you got to take him on this thing on the West Coast." And I think, wait a sec, climbing in the Alps and this kind of terrain are totally different things, and they are. But he did very well. We were glad to have him.
So as you go down into the Bull Valley, it can get it can get really nasty through some of the slide alder. But the creek is lovely. And then when you get down to the bottom, you get down to an area called Cedar Spirit Grove, which has some very large cedar trees and a few Douglas fir trees. And then we're on to 97. So Glenn, I did have your trip down, or your trip in the Stein under 96 from your notes, but
Well, that's what I have in my notes.
okay. So trip in 97 was a BMN trip to Pigeon Lake, and you can sneak on the bridge that crosses the creek that comes out of Widgeon Lake. Nice waterfall at the bridge. And then this is your first glimpse of Widgeon Lake with Peneplain Mountain in the background. And it's hard to kind of notice, but the rocks on the right here, that's actually an island, and that comes up again. And we were lucky enough that there was a pontoon raft that was there that we were able to go out and sticks and logs and things like that as some paddles. And we were able to paddle over to the little island. And somebody had built a cabin there. Somebody with a float plane had brought in the material and built this cabin. So we continued on with the pontoon boat to go to close to the middle of the lake. So far that we were able to look down the south arm that goes off. At one time, the thought was to dam Widgeon Lake and actually either drill a hole or a tunnel through here and have water go into Coquitlam Lake. But that won't happen now. This was a trip to Gillespie Mountain. We drove in as far as we could, and then we hiked up to November Lake where we left our overnight packs. And we headed around November Lake and eventually climbed up through this little gap here and then up on the right-hand side here, passing along the way, looking down on November Lake. And this area in the background, that would have been our campground area when we came back the next day. So that's looking at Mount Gillespie. We were going to gain it from the left side and walk the ridge to the top. When we got to this point here, I was really wondering how we were ever going to get to the summit. It just looked overwhelming. But once you got on it, it was just more or less like a staircase, and it wasn't such a big deal to get to the top. And this is looking back at a glacier, and not known at the time, but later this peak in the background is known as Seed Peak, and this has become a very popular hike for people to do. Not as many people go up to Gillespie. It's a little more technical. And looking over towards the Five Fingers, it's these mountains in here. And there's a lot of Don Gillespie's family were on the trip, as well as Frank. And Frank always seems to make it into the center of the photographs. It's quite amazing. You'll see that in a few. And after we got to the summit and went back to November Lake, we camped overnight. And then the next day, we went off into an area called Homer Valley. And this is a little pond looking at the backside of Gillespie. And again, another photo of the backside of Gillespie. And you carry on, and there's lots of little lakes. This is traveling to the east. I believe the person I believe that's Frank right down there. And I think what we did, we ended up walking this sort of area here out to this point, and that's as far as we made it. And I think that's the lake. I think we called this one Boise Lake because it drained into the Boise Valley, which would be just off to the right. And I think it was only about a week or so later after doing Gillespie Mountain, Don Gillespie, Frank, and myself we decided we were going to try and go to the Five Fingers, which this is a picture taken from Pitt Lake, looking at the Five Fingers and Debec Creek. There'd been some old write-ups about how to get up to the Five Fingers, so we decided we'd try and go in there and get up in there. And so that's heading towards where we get off in the boat. I believe it was Frank's brother. I think it was Joe, but I'm not 100% sure, that gave us the boat ride up. And we got up the old road that went up Debec, and we got up into an area where it had been logged, but there were a lot of alder and it was tough going, and we were trying to find our way through all this. And looking at maps, we were trying to figure out which way we were going to go up to the Five Fingers, and I got outvoted in that Frank and Don figured that we should go up the I guess it'd be the east side of Disc Creek and go up that way. And I figured from all the other write-ups, they talked about crossing Disc Creek and going up. But anyway, so because we had spent so much time sort of trying to find our way in that area, we ended up having to camp on the alder choked roads. And that was my tent in the foreground. And Don and Frank were tenting in the next tent that you can see in the background. So we headed up the east side of Disc Creek, and we got to Disc Lake, and our plan was to go around Disc Lake and around this side here and make our way up in here and up into the Five Fingers area. And what we didn't know was that Frank went and investigated while we were, pardon me, setting up camp, and found that we actually couldn't get around the lake. So we had to kind of think of what we were going to do. We were going to be out for 7 days. So what were we going to do instead of going that route? So we got down to the lake level. And that's when Frank found out we couldn't go around. And funny enough, we actually found it looked like it had a bunch of animal bites in it and it had deflated. But obviously somebody had been there before us, and probably when the road was in a much better shape, and had come up here and carried some big tire tubes and some 2x4s and things that made a raft, as well as you can see Don holding one of a paddle, and there's another paddle over here. So a much better place to camp that night. And so the next day we decided to head up this ridge that was up above Disc Lake. So between Disc Lake and Spindle Lake, looking over at Obelisk Peak as well as Obelisk Lake. And this is looking down at Spindle Lake as well as Pitt Lake in the background. Simply because I was out in front of everybody else, and I came walking along, and all of a sudden this head popped up from behind this rock. And within a split second, I looked and thought dog, and I have no idea why I thought dog. We're out in the middle of nowhere. There's not going to be a dog. And all of a sudden that head dropped down and it was gone. So I went around, looked on the other side of this rock, and you could just see these skid marks of this bear that had taken off. I don't know if it ever seen a human. It's not an area that many people get up in. So this lake was nearby, so we called this lake Bear Lake. So this is interesting in that we got into our camp that night, and it had kind of started to fog in a little bit. And Don and Frank decided they were going to go off and kind of have a look around. And I stayed in camp so that they knew if it got in too foggy and that I'd be able to call out to them and they'd be able to find the camp. And what they stumbled across, which we knew there was a plane wreck up there, we just didn't know where it was. This is a Mitchell bomber. And so they stumbled across it. And then the next day it was even cloudier and socked in. And so we went and investigated the old bomber. I just going by memory here, it's I think either 52 or 54, I think the plane wreck was. There's if you look it up on the internet, there's all kinds of stories about it. So I think it was that day that we really didn't get too far in camp. It had just socked in, and when you're up in the Alpine like that, you just really can't move. So I remember sitting up against a rock. We had a tarp with us, and we had the tarp draping down from the rock, and just huddled against this rock. It was a little bit cold, not too bad, but Don and I both had gloves we put on, and we look over at Frank, and he doesn't have any gloves on, but he's got socks on his hands. And I say to him, Frank, gloves. He says, no, why carry gloves when you've got an extra pair of socks? So I thought that's pretty inventive. So we were trying to actually drop down to Widgeon Lake and hike out, which we had real trouble trying to find a good way down, which is probably the best thing, because we would have had some real trouble trying to get around Widgeon Lake. So I think we ended up spending another night in that camp because we couldn't move. And then we got up the next day and the weather was good, and we were able to hike out. And we hiked out through the Quebec Valley and then into the Widgeon Valley. And we ended up getting home a day late. From our camp, this is Judge Howe. It's funny, in the slide, it's actually yellow, but when I did the scan, the yellow kind of disappeared on the photo. And on the way down, this beautiful little lake just below Disk Lake. And now we're on to 98 and 99. So this was a trip to Hector Fur Lake, which is in Golden Ears Park. It's about a 30-kilometer round trip, but we did it as an overnighter where we camped on Gold Creek and then went up to Hector Ferguson Lake. Some beautiful old growth trees along the trail. And this is the trail along Gold Creek. This was a trip into the Stoltman Wilderness, which is about 100 kilometers north of Squamish. It's an area that was up for logging, and the Wilderness Committee was in there building trails and trying to get people in there and trying to protect the area. And some of the area did end up getting protected. It was named after a famous sort of climber and skier named Randy Stoltman, which he's written a few books. He passed away on a skiing trip back in the mid-90s. So one of the bridges the Wilderness Committee built. Some beautiful waterfalls in the area. We even stopped to take breaks sometimes and have something to drink. So this was an interesting bridge that the Wilderness Committee built. They built it out of ladders. So it was a little rickety, but it got us across the creek, that's for sure. And this is the Ilaho River up near the top, and quite a canyon. And then on to 2000. Trip to Petgill Lake, which Petgill Lake is on the way to Squamish. And this is Elsay Lake. Elsay Lake is near Mount Seymour. There's the, sort of the three peaks of Mount Seymour, and then there's Runner Peak, and then Elsay, and then on the other side of that is Elsay Lake. So I think this was about a 9-hour hike to get in and back out again, just as a day trip. It's quite a nice lake. Yeah, that's Elsay Peak in the background. And Frank's always up for an adventure. So, saw a tree over there. Hey, Frank, how about going over there and sitting on that tree? Let's call it the horse tree. It's like, Frank's up for it. So always a smile on his face, as Glenn said. And, I just so many good times on the trail with Frank, jokes and kidding around with each other, and that is quite amazing. This trip was kind of interesting on the way back. we had to, well, on the way back after the ski. And as we were starting to go through the ski area where there's, a lot of low bush where the ski runs are, we'd encountered somebody coming the other way saying, "Oh, you better watch out. There's a black bear in the area." And so we go, "Okay, yeah, we'll watch out for that." So we're on the trail and I'm kind of walking a little timidly. And when we come around a corner, I'm moving a little bit slow. And Frank's getting annoyed at me and he says, "Oh, move out of the way." And so Frank kind of, pushes me aside and starts, tromping down. And couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes later, I'm right behind Frank. And all of a sudden he jumps back like something spooked him. And I turn around and I look, and it's a black dog that Frank got scared by. So, yeah, anyways, so wasn't a bear at all. Well, I'm sure there was a bear there, but it was a black bear or black dog that spooked Frank. So. I was hoping that Linda Saunders could be on the call tonight, but she's off on a skiing trip. I don't know if people knew that. I think they made either 2 or 3 trips, Linda, Dawn, and Frank and some other people, into Night Inlet. There was a fishing lodge there, and they went in. They built trails. So Linda gave me some photos, and I'll just go through them. I wanted to go on these trips, but at that time I had limited holidays, and it just didn't seem worthwhile for me to go in for a week to make trails for a lodge and not explore other areas. So again, they went in by float plane, took all the gear with them, because weren't just staying at the lodge, they were camping out, bringing all their trail equipment. This was the log that was actually on the trail. Really nice waterfall. In their camp, I guess it must have had some wet days when they were up there. If I remember right, I think they went in the sort of the springtime or early summer. And this was always interesting. I always heard about the picnic table that they built, and I'd never seen a photograph of it until just a few days ago. So this, you can see the log there. Frank's got a rope on the log, and they're moving these logs down through the stream down to where they want to build this picnic table. So they took the logs and they took all the bark off. Pretty amazing, the bark that came off of these logs. And then this is the start of the picnic table. That's John. He was the chainsaw guy on this trip. And that's what they ended up with. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And just a photo of them on the boat. I don't know if they went fishing or not, but they might have. They also had, they did the work on the trails, but they also had some days where they went off in different things. There's grizzly bear in the area. So that's part of the promotion that the lodge does, not just fishing. So they went out kayaking one day and they got to see grizzlies on the shore. And so this was a trip with Frank and my friend Dave to Wedgemont Lake, which is north of Whistler. This was just a day trip, quite a bit of elevation gain for this one. Glacier Lake. If you look on the far left on the rocks, that's the Wedgemont shelter. Yeah, just a stunning area. Never get tired of that color of the aqua green glacier lakes. And from the same area, looking back down to the valley that Whistler's in. Nice waterfall. And this was an interesting trip across Burns Bog. There was they're still fighting to try and protect, parts of Burns Bog. It was on the news again the other day that they want to take parts of it out. But we had a guide to guide us across Burns Bog. And so he knew the way, there's lots of wetlands, just quite beautiful area. But something that interesting that happened probably about 3/4 of the way up across this trip. I noticed that the bottom of Frank's shoe was starting to flap. It was starting to become loose. And I don't know. And it was like 10 minutes later, I looked down at Frank and the bottom of his shoe was gone. And I said, Frank, where'd it go? And he says, oh, I lost it. And so he holds up the bottom of his boot, and it's got no more rubber on it. It's just got the bit of padding that's between him and his foot. And he carried on. We're in Burns Bog. It's pretty soft and that. So he was able to just carry on and walk out. And it was one of those trips that we were heading towards, I guess it was the Alex Fraser Bridge is where we were going to come out. And it just seems the trip just seemed to go on and on and on of how long it took to get there. And anyways, Frank lost his soul on. So along the way, this is some sundew. This is a carnivorous plant. We saw some sandhill cranes. And there's machinery in there from when they were sort of farming the bog or the peat, I guess. Interesting, this lady that's on the trip, she was probably Erin Rutherford. She's now BC Parks Ranger, and we've been working with her in the Pinecombe Park. So 2001, Frank would have turned 70 that year. I was only half his age at that time. So this is a trip to Lynn Peak. This is the Second Narrows Bridge down here. So if you're coming across Second Narrows Bridge, you look right up at Lynn Peak. This is in the Chilliwack Valley. This is to the Celessi Memorial. We'd actually planned to do another hike that day, but the route that we planned to go up was too overgrown and too wet, so we decided to do this hike instead. If you're not familiar with the Celessi story, it's a plane that crashed right into Celessi in 1956. You can now hike up to what's known as the Propeller Monument. We didn't on this particular day, but it's a protected site. And along the way, we found a toad. This is Mount Outram. If you follow the 103 Hikes books, this is an 8,000-foot peak with 6,000 feet of elevation gain, so a major undertaking. Just trying to think, there was 5 of us on this trip. Glenn was on this trip, Frank, myself, Don Gillespie, and a guy by the name of Brent. So that's the summit with Brent on top. And Brent's always up to doing something crazy, so he's up on the ridge. And just down below us would be the community of Hope. And just looking on our way down. Now, one of the funny stories with Frank on the way down, that there was a little creek that we had to cross on the way up. And so anyways, on the way down, this is a major undertaking. 6,000 feet of elevation gain is a lot. And so on the way down, I'm not sure if I was making comments about Frank, if he could make it or whatever down and that. And anyways, we got to this creek and I said to Frank, I said, Frank, do you need help, getting across this creek? And he says, yeah, I'll just climb on your back. So I said, okay. So he actually jumps up like piggyback on my back. And as soon as he realized that I was actually going to walk across the creek with him on my back, he jumped off. This was a trip to the Burke North Summit. And so we got up on the summit where we're actually looking back at Monroe Lake. But the main goal of this trip was to go to and put up this sign. So this was that was named after Doug Benny. And this was an interesting trip. This was in the Manning Park area. This was part of the Skagit Trail, or the route from the Skagit Valley to Gibson's Pass. And so we had 6 people, and we divided into 2 groups, 3 on one side, 3 the other. We exchanged vehicles ahead of time. One group being myself and someone known as Paul Van Penen, which some of the people on the call tonight know Paul. He was in with Frank and I, and the other three, Mark, Glenn, and Don, started up at Manning Park. So Frank, Paul, and myself, we had to serve the tougher route where we had to gain more elevation. And so we started down low, and the trails, fabulous, well graded and everything else. But Paul is a very fit person. He's done a lot of cycling, a lot of Arctic trips, paddling, just an all around really fit guy. And he takes off at this pace, just unbelievable pace, going up these switchbacks. And Frank and I are both looking at each other going, we're going way too fast. Like this is like 20 some kilometers that we have to go. And I think cumulative elevation gain again around 6,000 feet. And so we've got a long day ahead of us. We shouldn't be going this fast. Anyways, Frank and I keep up with Paul, tearing up this trail. And but sure enough, when we get to some areas where there's some side trips to go out to, like Lone Goat Peak, and one other one, I can't remember the name of the peak offhand, that Paul's too tired to go up to these side trips. But sure enough, Frank and I make our way to that's Hosumine in the background. And I don't know what Frank had eaten that day, but boy, he had all kinds of energy in him. On the way down from one of these peaks where we're going to meet back up with Paul, that Frank decides to start running down this hill. And like, I'll beat you to the bottom kind of idea. So I'm tearing down this hill, and there's all kinds of like little holes and stuff. It's not the greatest thing to be running on or whatever. But anyways, we made it down to the bottom safely. About halfway along, we met up with the other group. And so, hey, here's another photo, or a photo where Frank's not wearing jeans, and they don't even look like they're cutoffs. So I mentioned Paul Van Penen. He's in the foreground in the middle. And of course, we have Don, Mark, myself in the background, Glenn, and of course, Frank. So we exchanged the keys there and then went back to the vehicles. So, sorry, I'll go back to this. So the other funny thing that happened on this trip was that I don't know if Frank and I got talking about who was going to make it back to the vehicle first or what it was, but anyways, we weren't even really sure where the car was parked. We knew what the car was, but so we got down to the parking lot, and it was a pretty big parking lot. And we're sort of walking across this big parking lot, and the car's at the far end. And Frank turns to me and says, "Look at that." And as I turned my head to the side to look at whatever Frank was wanting me to look at, he's making a bolt. He's running. This is after 24 kilometers and huge elevation gains. Frank's running for the car to get there before me. And of course, I'm up for the challenge and that. So I start tearing off Frank and meet up with him at the vehicle. So anyways, lots of energy. Frank's just absolutely amazing. So 2002 to 2005. So this was actually a BMN hike to Mount Amatus. Now, I didn't actually go on this hike, but I did go there. I think it was a year later with my friend Terry. And so I just threw in a couple of photos of Mount Amatus. That's looking down on Cultus Lake in the Fraser Valley. And a little closer to home, this is the Coquitlam Lakeview Trail, the old viewpoint. And that's Brent and Frank looking over the map. And just on the road coming down towards the gate. This was a trip in Woodhaven Swamp in Belcarra Park and Sassamat Lake. So there's Woodhaven Swamp. And we saw a few geese with little young at Sassamat Lake. And a trip into Lynn Creek area. We went to some big trees in Kennedy Falls. So a picture of Kennedy Falls. Another one. And then lower Kennedy Falls. And this was a trip to Monroe Lake and the Village Trail. So it was a crossover of Burke Mountain. So this is the village trail. At this time, you go through a lot of wet areas. Since that time, between Lyle and myself, we've rerouted around a lot of these wet areas, and the village trail is a lot nicer now. But one thing that was really great on this trip was the blueberries. There were tons and tons of blueberries, and people were just gorging themselves on the blueberries. Even so much that people's teeth were turning blue. In 2006, Frank's turned 75. So this was Woodland Walk, which we do like an annual hike on the Woodland Walk to celebrate the anniversary of Pinecone Provincial Park. Before we got a nice bridge across Pritchard Creek, we had to go up there and either rearrange rocks or put logs down and boardwalk and rubber and different things to get people across the creek. And this was a trip back up to the Coquitlam Lakeview Trail. And it was interesting, hadn't thought about it when I planned this trip, but BC Parks actually came out on this trip, which is an extreme rarity. A couple of rangers came out. And what I hadn't thought of at the time was this hike was actually scheduled a week before I was getting married. And so we kind of deemed this as my stag, which is kind of interesting. We went up there, did the hike, and as well as did some trail work. And so a little bit of trail work on the day. Not too many people have a hike and trail work for their stag. 2007, 2010, not as many trips. Frank's getting a little bit older. Frank didn't just come on our trips. He did the things with his family, and we would hear about some of those stories, some of the things that he did with his friends and family, and that. Frank was a busy guy. So this in UBC Research Forest. And this was in the Belcarry. I think we called this Bunsen Creek, but it went up to White Rock Viewpoint as well as Cypress Lake. And I'm noticing that I'm just over the time. So that's looking down from the White Rock Viewpoint. And the group on that day. And that's looking up from the roads down below, looking up this rock here is what they call the White Rock Viewpoint. From Coquitlam Center and different areas, you can see this rock up on Eagle Ridge. Now down to Cypress Lake. And this is two bluffs. I just love the colors in this photo. So this was a trip mainly led by Brent. He'd done a lot of work in this area, putting in some roots to the viewpoint. Some mushrooms along the way. And then we got to the viewpoint. I go to this viewpoint quite regularly now. I probably go up there maybe 5 times a year or something like that. It's getting more popular now, but at one time you would never see people there. Now when I go there, you almost always see somebody either coming or going from the viewpoint. But it's just a wonderful view looking back towards Vancouver from there, and it's North Vancouver. BMN had a trip into the upper pit. So this is the lodge up there by Danny and Lee Garrick. They were instrumental in having Pinecone Park become a park. Some of us camped out, some stayed in the lodge. And we got to go on a rafting trip, which was great. On the upper pit. So we went up towards where the hot springs are and rafted down to where the lodge is. The lodge is about 7 kilometers up from the head of Pitt Lake. And there's the group that I was in with Frank and Don. And we also went to the hot springs, which you can see the bridge in the background, and a little wall here that stops the hot water from going into the cold upper pit. And another photo, Frank's not wearing his jeans. So that's just 3 trips. And we did a little bit of hiking there. This was up to a nice waterfall. And in the evenings, had a campfire. I think we were there for 2 nights and 3 days. And this was to Hayward Lake, which is out towards Mission. Beautiful trees in the area. There used to be a nice loop that you could do around the lake, but I don't think you can do that anymore. I think one of the bridges has been taken out. I think this. I'm not sure if this is the bridge that's been taken out or not, but it might be. And we're always goofing around at things. Mark's a chaplain. We find this thing that kind of looks like the Pope's chair. So anyways, we honor Mark. Now Frank's turning 80. Sheep Paddock Trail. Sheep Paddock Trail is something that Frank was so keen on keeping open, especially the original one that was put in. Don and Dave Benny, or sorry, Doug Benny were part of putting in the trail. Frank also worked on the trail, putting it in, and he wanted to keep it open. And I remember in later years, Frank used to cut back the blackberry, and he got to the point that he said, Ian, the blackberry's just growing too fast. He said, I can't keep it cut back. So I remember being part of a group, Glenn and myself, and I can't remember who else was all there. Of course, Frank was there, but we went in and we cut back the blackberry as well as a bunch of other the vegetation. The Sheep Paddock Trail has now been rerouted, and where there used to be a bunch of nice small bridges, they've taken the trail away from there. But my plan is still to have a hike or a walk at the Sheep Paddock Trail in Frank's honor. So hopefully in the next couple months we'll be able to do that. And one of the bridges that they took out, the trail was closed for at least 12 years, and for really no apparent reason. But Metro Vancouver wanted to put in a trail that they could drive their vehicle on. And back in the area. Nest box cleaning. I am getting close to the end. Nest box cleaning. Frank was heavily involved in the nest box cleaning. I don't have a lot of photos of Frank doing the nest box cleaning, but not only did he come out in Widgeon, Colony Farm, Minnetonka, that Frank also repaired the nest boxes as well. This was on an interesting trip. One of the follow boxes, we saw these pellets. We weren't sure what they were, so we, being naturalists, we opened them up and we found crayfish claws in them, and we still weren't really sure what they were. And there's hair in there as well. And then we looked it up later and found out that it's pellets that the great blue herons regurgitate and spit out, the stuff that they don't want to break down. And many boxes at the Widgeon area. Again, Frank at the boxes in the Widgeon. And in the Widgeon area, they have a lot of film sets, and this was a film set there for a little town, and that was the bait shack or something like that. And Frank's at the back right. So in 2013 was the last time that Frank climbed Golden Ears. He was 82 years old, and he climbed Golden Ears over 30 times. That is absolutely amazing. I know Frank, how difficult he said his last time going up, how difficult it was on him and that, but absolutely amazing. I've been on Golden Ears twice. So just absolutely amazing. And I never did a trip to the top of and I wish I had, but anyways, never happened. I threw in a few photos. This is a BMN hike that we did to Golden Ears, Mark and Dave. And from the summit, you look down onto Raven Lake and Gold Creek, and also down onto Pitt Lake. And the place that we never got to was the Five Fingers, and I'm still trying to get into that area. So hopefully one day I'll get into the Five Fingers. And I believe this is the Mount Gillespie area. I'll have to check, but this looks like it's Seed Peak, and that might be Gillespie. And there's also another peak in there called Pollen Peak. But that's what I think that area is. And this is looking over towards Widgeon Peak and Coquitlam Mountain, which that's always a great memory with Frank doing Coquitlam Mountain. And then the peak that I want to do is Gabbro over on the right there. And I remember talking to Frank at his 90th birthday and asking if he'd ever gone up on the south summit of Golden Ears, which that's this peak right here. And he says, "Oh yeah, a couple of times." And so that's my next goal, is when I do Golden Ears the next time, is to make an attempt in getting up on the south summit. So for the 20th anniversary of Pinecone Park, which was in 2015, it was the same year that the Pinecone stewards signed an agreement with BC Parks, and Frank was still wanted to continue being part of the trail crew, so he would sign on to the agreement. Which Frank is right in the dead center of the group for the 20th anniversary. I thank John Saremba for this photo. Just great having this, and some of Doug Benny's old signs up there. Some of those signs are now up on the trails. They were in my garage and Don's garage for quite a while, but now some of them are up on some trees up on the mountain. But great to be able to celebrate the 20th anniversary. This wasn't the 20th anniversary, but a picture of Frank is right here on one of the what we call the big stump, the big cedar stump on the Woodland Walk. And this was in the Widgeon Falls area, putting some anti-slip rubber down on the boardwalks. That's Frank, of course, and Linda in the background. This was a real interesting outing, because not only Frank was there, we had a father and son, which the son, I believe, was Jacob, I think his name was 6 years old. So we had Frank, I believe Frank was around 86. We had a 6-year-old, and we had Sean. And Sean started coming out doing trail work with me in 2014 when he was 17. And Sean is actually 31 years younger than me. And we've been up on Widgeon Peak twice together. We've been through the part of the Fool's Gold Trail and that. So it's kind of interesting that, I was 35 years younger than Frank, and Sean is 31 years younger than me. And it's kind of hoping that the same sort of legacy and that Sean and I can have is do a lot of hikes, and that I can stay in, good enough shape for a long enough time that can still do a lot more trips. And this was on the South Slope Trail. Nothing beyond Frank to climb up a tree just to put up a trail marker. And I threw this one in because I actually took this photo just a couple of weeks ago. I was up on Burke Mountain on the Coquitlam Lakeview Trail and the South Slope Trail. And this log here, I know it's half covered in snow and that, it doesn't look like much, but I remember like 20 years ago, Frank and I working on this trail, and it was so wet, and we didn't have a lot in the way of tools. And at that time, the forest was a lot smaller. There weren't a lot of logs around. We dragged this log, out of the bush, put it down, and put these rocks all along either side of it so you could walk on and stay out of the water. And it's still there. I don't know if anybody uses it because it doesn't seem to be as wet as it used to be there. But I just passing by it a couple of weeks ago, I just thought that's a photo we got to put in the show. I don't know if I've ever taken a photo of it before, but every time I go by there, it reminds me of the work that I did with Frank. And Frank came on a lot of the solstice cycles. Now, I threw this next photo in simply because if you look on the back of Frank's bike, it's a pump. And I remember on this one particular trip, I believe it was on this trip here, because Frank, I know definitely was on this trip, but he's not in the photograph. And what happened was Frank was having one of his tires was leaking. And he kept on kind of stopping and using his pump and pumping it up. And then he would carry on a bit further and it would go down. And it just got to the point that it was leaking too fast. And I had a spare tube with me. So I said, Frank, you want to take the tube? He says, okay. So Frank hung back and we carried on, and he changed the tube. He had the pumped his tire back up, and then met up back with us. And, didn't think too much of it, just give Frank the tube. Don't worry about it. And then sure enough, the next time I meet Frank, he's got a new tube and a box and everything else ready to give it to me, just everything else that he wanted to, pay his dues, that I gave him a tube that he wants to give me it back. So, and I don't know if people remember these old Poco Trail signs. I think this might have been the last one. I was just so happy to get a photo of it. I hope somewhere some of these signs are in some sort of archives or something, because they used to be on every mile of the Poco Trail. And then they just started slowly disappearing. Even Joe, Frank's brother, joined us on at least a couple of solstice cycles. And this was the last one in 2019. So this trip, instead of doing the Poco Trail, we actually did a trip up onto the new Golden Ears Bridge. Looking down on the Fraser River, and then partway across the bridge. And then the big climb up the other side. I know Frank had a little bit of trouble with it, but yeah, he just kept on going. And then we got up to the pedestrian crossing at the top. And I'd heard this story before, but Frank was always, he liked to tell stuff about his kids and different stories and that, and telling the story of when John arranged to take Frank to the top of one of the I think I said the Golden Ears Bridge, but it's probably the Port Mann Bridge. But anyways, to the top of the tower of the Port Mann Bridge. So that was something I think was a real highlight for Frank to be able to do that. And he would talk about it, or told me a couple of times about it. So it was interesting on the cycle trip that we were able to look at that. And then the final hike final BMN hike I did with Frank. And sure enough, it was the final hike I did with Don Gillespie as well. March 4th, it's the old joke of what's the best day of the year to go for a hike? March 4th. So this was in 2017. We were doing the South Poco Loop. And so the big group out there, Don had some family out for it. You never know when the last time you're going to be doing a trip with somebody in that. So it was a big crowd of people out on this day. Kind of almost similar to this year. We got a little bit of snow on March 4th in 2017. Lucky enough, there was a shelter up at, I think this is called Settlers Park. And so anyways, we got a group photo up there. And this time Frank's not in the middle, he's way off to the left side over here. And I think Don's hiding in the back there. So Christmas bird count 2019. This was the last Christmas bird count Frank came out on. And Lori, his daughter-in-law, this is Lori here. She was able to come out with Frank. Frank's right in the back there in the middle. We can't tell if he's wearing jeans on this day, but I assume he's wearing jeans. So, and the last photo of the evening, and this was such a wonderful celebration for Frank's 90th birthday in his backyard. Fire trucks, huge people, great stories, lots of food, just an amazing day. And for me, just brought that sort of that full circle around. The first connection that I had with Frank was doing the slip and slide in his backyard. And sure enough, I'm back in Frank's backyard, celebrating his 90th birthday. So if anybody wants to stick around, love to talk about Frank. Otherwise, I understand if people want to head out. I will stop my share if anybody has any questions, or I'm willing to stay for as long as people are willing to stick around.
Hi, Ian. I just wanted to say thank you so much for such an awesome presentation on behalf of Julia, Jenna, and John. We learned so much about what Frank did, and he was an incredible person to do all the hiking he did for so long as he did. And he inspired me as well. I went on my first backcountry hike last summer. And I asked Frank, I said, do you have any words of advice for going on the North Coast Trail, something I'd never done before, even slept overnight? And he said, yes, just take it one step at a time. And I don't know how many times that went through my mind, because it was pretty difficult.
Right.
But I thought of Frank all along the way and what he was able to do. And he just inspired me to do that. So thank you again for that wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. My advice to you is not wear jeans. That would be my advice. So.
I didn't realize he wore jeans on every hike.
Oh, it's just. I knew he did. I knew he did it a lot, but I didn't realize that it was much as when I was putting the presentation together. And believe me, my wife, the first hike that I met her on, she was wearing jeans, and we got rain, and the jeans are like, falling down, and this was before we even started liking each other or whatever. And I'm telling her, it's the worst thing to wear. But Frank, his whole life, that's what he wore, so it worked for him.
It did. Thank you very much. And on behalf of Carolyn and Tony too, and Dan, thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Ian. It was great.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks.
Anybody, any questions?
No questions, but it was really good pictures. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great insight.
Thanks.
And
Totally impressed.
You visited all those lakes. Did you ever go swimming?
Oh, I went swimming in
cold.
no, Disc Lake I swam in. I don't know how many people have swum in Disc Lake, but I went swimming there. So yeah. Brian, if you're going to take off, you'll probably have to make me the host. Otherwise it'll close it down. If you're going to take off.
Okay. Well, I'm recording, so
you can stop the recording.
Okay. Right.